Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 51. Phil and Clint. Phil's life had been busy the last 2 weeks. Surprisingly, though, it had not been anywhere near as busy as he'd feared it would be in the wake of the invasion. This was thanks in large part to the inestimable Pepper Potts. The damage done in the battle had been extensive, but with so many people on their side of the fight, it had been rather less than it otherwise could have been. Especially if more than 3 of the enormous armored flying creatures, space whales, had gotten past Thor and Storm's Black Aid. The smaller airborne vehicles hadn't been able to do anywhere near the damage one of the space whales would have managed. A single space whale would have done more damage just plowing into a building than a good 2 dozen of the smaller craft, and that didn't take the infantry and additional armaments the space whales had carried into account. Professionally, Phil refused to call them space whales. Tony seemed to have been the one to coin the phrase and would never let Phil live down if he caught Phil using it. So he made a point of not using the phrase aloud, but he did think of them as such in his private thoughts. At any rate, Phil's usual tasks in the wake of a large-scale attack involved coordinating relief and salvage efforts, ensuring necessary supplies and personnel reached the affected area in a timely manner, and liaising with the military and emergency personnel that had responded to the crisis in addition to the SHIELD personnel. Such tasks generally took 30 hours out of his day, which is to say they generally took more time than he actually had. This time, however, Pepper Potts had been right in the thick of it, primarily because Stark Industries and Iron Man had been the epicenter of the attack. Phil had figured out very, very quickly, after meeting her for the first time, that Pepper was, in virtually every way, his counterpart. Ruthlessly competent and efficient, capable of winning and holding the trust of people who generally didn't even trust themselves, never mind anyone else. And completely underestimated by pretty much everyone outside of a very small circle of people. With Pepper on the case, Phil's workload in the aftermath of the attack had been cut in half. He had appreciated the break. It had allowed him to keep a closer eye on Clint than he otherwise would have been able to manage. Not that he thought Clint still compromised or the like, but he knew Clint well enough to know that being mind-controlled was going to cause Clint considerable issues. Not that any human would appreciate such a violation. Snipers, however, had a universal, near obsessive-compulsive need to control as many variables as they possibly could in the execution of their jobs. It was a need that tended to carry over into other aspects of life. As such, any sniper would react a bit more negatively than the average. Clint would react more poorly still. He had completely understandable issues with authority of any description, given what he'd been subjected to before Phil had become his handler. Abuse of authority never failed to bring out Phil's most insubordinate tendencies. That he had been forced to accept orders he would otherwise never have obeyed and been unable to fight back was going to end up driving Clint up a wall. All the proof that Phil needed to know Clint wasn't dealing well was how quiet Clint was. It was to be expected when Clint was around the other Avengers. He did not know them, therefore did not trust them, and would not risk giving them ammunition to use against him. But Clint had been worryingly quiet even when it was just Phil and Natasha, both of whom he trusted and who trusted him in return. Phil knew it would be a while yet before the subject could be broached. Pushing Clint to do something he didn't want to or wasn't ready to do was a very, very bad idea. One that the handlers that had worked with him before Fury chucked Clint at Phil had figured out the hard way. Clint would come to them in his own time. Hopefully today would help with that. It had long been their habit that whenever schedules permitted, they'd meet up for an evening wherein work in any form was forbidden. All too often, they'd only manage 1 or 2 such nights in a 6-month period. Generally, they ordered in some junk food and watched movies on such nights, talking over whatever non-work subjects tickled their fancies. In the early days of their team, such nights had been used to get Natasha up to speed on movie pop culture references. She had known both the references and the name of the movies they came from, but had never watched the movie, and as a result tended to not fully understand the significance of the reference. Her Well, Phil refused to use the word trainers, even if that's what Natasha called them. Anyway, the people who had turned her into a Black Widow had realized that in order to blend in properly, the widows would need to know pop culture, but had deemed actually watching the movies in question a waste of time. It had also been an exercise in Natasha learning what she liked and didn't like for herself, by exposing her to as many genres of movies as they could manage. In their attempts to craft both the perfect weapon and the perfect infiltrator, the Red Room had eliminated virtually everything that involved free will of any description, including having preferences for anything. While Natasha had somehow managed to become able to think for herself enough to walk away from them, she had largely stuck to what she knew once out of their grasp. It hadn't been until Clint spared her life and Phil had become her handler that she'd been afforded the opportunity to become more than a weapon. As if his thoughts summoned them, both Natasha and Clint arrived in Phil's quarters at that point. Clint via the catwalks, while Natasha took the more pedestrian route of arriving via the elevators. Both Natasha and Clint were burdened with takeout bags, and a second bag which had paper plates and plastic cutlery. They deposited their burdens on the coffee table in front of the couch. It had taken all three of them a few days to realize that all three floors of their apartments were interconnected by well-hidden crawlways accessible only via the catwalks and platforms that Tony had installed on the 3 floors. It was things like that that made Phil want to bounce Fury's head off a wall for a few times due to his treatment of Tony. Well, Fury and a lot of other people. Either that or laugh at just how thoroughly they'd all been snookered. For all of Tony's apparent flash and swagger, he had more than a little in common with Natasha when it came to being able to play people like fiddles. He might not be able to manage turning into a completely different person the way she could, but Tony's ability to read people and get them to react the way he wanted them to was nearly as good as hers. Tony had gotten a room full of rabid paparazzi to sit on the floor with an offhand comment and gesture or two, and he'd been fresh from Afghanistan at the time and thus hardly at the top of his game. Yes, Natasha and Tony had a thing or two in common, the most important of which was that you underestimated them at your peril. Hilariously, both of them managed to get people to underestimate them with disconcerting regularity. Phil considered the fallout to be poetic justice. Any preferences as to movie? Phil asked, mentally shaking off his thoughts. I was thinking R.E.D., Clint proffered. Phil glanced at Natasha, who nodded. I like that one, she said. Those sorts of movies could be hit or miss with the three of them. Most of the movies that tried to depict alphabet soup agencies seriously tended to irritate them with the inaccuracies and ineptitude of the agents. The movies like R.E.D. Get Smart and such, the ones that were deliberately over the top and pointed and laughed at the genre they got a kick out of. R.E.D. in particular got an extra vote of approval for its all too rare positive portrayal of Russian characters. Far too often Russian characters were depicted as either evil incarnate, incompetent, or both, which never failed to aggravate Natasha, even if she understood it. After all, Russian entertainments tended to do the same thing where Americans were involved and probably would for a long time to come, even if the Cold War had ended. Jarvis, if you would, please, Phil asked as the three of them loaded plates and settled in. Clint parked himself on a platform with a good view of the television, while Natasha settled on the far end of the couch from Phil. Clint had spent the first half of the movie trying not to brood. He'd been doing his best to not brood, period, over the last 2 weeks. In a very weird way, it helped that he had essentially been unchanged, despite the mind control. It allowed him to sort of pretend it had been a mission and his choice. It really helped that S.H.I.E.L.D. casualties due to his actions had been virtually non-existent. No one had died, though there had been injuries during the attempted takeover of the helicarrier. It also helped that he'd learned young how to compartmentalize like a pro. He knew Nat and Phil were worried about him. If he was being honest with himself, he'd even admit they had reason to be. Hilariously, being here helped. Having so many people to watch to figure out kept him distracted from his own troubles to a surprising degree. Learning everyone's tics and habits and personalities outside of a file was always a good time. Especially since the files almost always got something wrong somewhere. It was kind of hard to distill a person into words on paper. Plus, as good as S.H.I.E.L.D.'s various agents were, they were none of them gnats and could easily misread a target. But about halfway through the movie, Clint started to feel twitchy. Most snipers sacrificed their awareness of their immediate surroundings in favor of the target in their scopes. They depended on a spotter to watch their backs. Until Phil, Clint had never been able to trust someone like that. It had ironically turned him into Hawkeye, because he had been forced to learn to see and pay attention to everything while still being able to bullseye his target. He developed a very reliable, oh shit, alert over the years thanks to having to watch his own back. He always knew when he was being watched, when danger threatened. That awareness was being set off now. Quietly at first, but then more insistently, until Clint was pulled away from the movie. He frowned as he looked around the apartment, trying to figure out where a threat could come from. Half a second later, the penny dropped. "Down!" he bellowed, lunging off the platform he'd been sitting on. There was nothing between him and the window. Phil and Nats never hesitated, both of them flinging themselves to the ground, trusting him and his trouble radar. Clint was midair, tucking to roll when he hit the ground, when there was a god almighty crack from the direction of the window. God bless Tony Stark's paranoid heart. The glass didn't shatter, at least not from a single bullet. Clint really didn't fancy their chances if a hail of bullets came their way. It turned out that wasn't going to be much of an issue. The metal panels Clint had seen in action during the invasion slammed down over the window just as Clint landed. He rolled and tumbled to his feet. "Sniper," Phil said. It was less of a question, more of a statement. "Yeah! Given the angle, I'd say Trump Tower. It and the Chrysler Building are the only buildings with the right height, and the Chrysler shape makes internal or external sniper nests problematic," Clint said. There were too few windows on the upper stories of the Chrysler Building, and the curves and pointed top of the upper stories made perching on the outside virtually impossible. Trump Tower, on the other hand, was flat-topped with lots of windows. "Jarvis, are you able to calculate the angle of the bullet's impact?" Phil wanted to know. "Indeed, Agent Coulson," Jarvis said, then rattled off the relevant figures. "I have informed Sir of this incident as well. Should I inform the rest of the Avengers?" Phil shook his head. "No, there's nothing most of them can do at the moment." Then he cocked his head. "Unless... can Loki teleport someone in addition to himself?" "My guess is top floor," Clint said after thinking it through. "Apartment of someone single, if possible, married but with no kids. If not, someone who works night shift considering the time. Break in when they leave, and you've got the place to yourself for a solid 6 hours or more." "Mr. Ferguson indicates he is at your disposal, Agent Coulson," Jarvis said on the heels of Clint's assessment. "Tell him to teleport to the top floor. It'll take the sniper longer than this to get out of there. Worst comes to worst, he'll catch them in the elevator," Phil said. "Tell him to bring Thor as backup. Snipers don't usually work alone, and there's no telling whether this one has just a partner or an entire team, given who they were aiming at."